Hang on.
Good morning, everybody. Already the third and final day. We welcome this morning Laura Felline from Rome. She is going to tell us all about structural explanation. Laura, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thanks first of all to Fred and to his students. I'm sorry they're not here today, like now. Raul and Jelci. They're being very kind and very helpful. So yes, structural explanation. In the foundations of physics, there have been and there still are many arguments that try to contribute to issues of ontology, foundations, by using the concept of explanation and the theory, the philosophical theories, the philosophical achievements that we gained with the study of the concept of explanation. In particular, in the foundations of physics, there is a kind of scientific explanation that in the last 20 years have received a lot of attention. That is what is called now usually a mathematical explanation of empirical facts. It's not only in the foundations of physics, it's a kind of explanation that that's what they advocate, say, claim applies to a bunch of phenomena in the sciences. And it's more than natural to use this kind of explanation in the foundations of fields of physics, a field where that is highly mathematized, where explanation is not only very important in the description of phenomena, but also in their explanation. I think this is fine, but I think that there are some limitations in this strategy that depend a lot on the context of inquiry and on pragmatics. So although some of these limitations depend on features that might seem philosophically not really interesting, not really deep, I think failure to take these kind of features into account when we move from one context to the other might lead to avoidable mistakes. Okay, structural explanation is a kind of account of a variety of explanation in the foundations of physics that has always, at least in the way it was formulated in the origin and the way I personally have developed it, is linked to the goal of understanding specific case studies in the foundations of physics. So it is especially linked to this very specific context of science. So in this paper, because we are talking, I will try to provide a general view of what I mean by structural explanation. By the way, I'm talking about what I mean by structural explanation and by what I think his my hero and the first guy who thought about it for me, Rick Hughes, meant about it. But there are plenty of people that develop a different approach to what they call structural explanation in the foundations of physics. Fred is one of them, but also Lisa Bokulic have said very interesting things about the subject, but they are more about either what it means a structure or what it means an explanation. In this talk, since the way I have developed this characterization of structural explanation is really linked to the understanding of specific case studies and debates in the foundations of physics. So what I'm not going to do is to provide a general explication of the notion of scientific explanation, with a normative role for the study of what we're going to work on. I'm not going to give an ontological account of structure. I'm going to be liberal in the idea of what a structure is. I can take it as a worldly set of relations, but it can also be something like Jonathan was talking about yesterday or 2 days ago. Like the structure is the most fundamental description. It's not like a bunch of relations. I am going to say something about fundamentality because I'm going to say that the structural explanation is an explanation of fundamental phenomena. So of course I'm going to say something about what I mean by fundamental, but it's not going to be probably what this audience might think in the very beginning. It's not a metaphysical account. So what are we going to do? This is my plan for this talk. I'm gonna give my characterization of structural explanation as a variety of explanation, and I'm gonna say that one of the important features that characterize it is that it is also an explanation of singular events. Then I'm going to pass to, and I'm going to say that this characterizes structural explanation against all the others mathematical explanations in science of empirical facts, of course. So I'm going to, in the second part of the talk, I am going to say that mathematical explanation of empirical facts fail to explain singular events. In the third part of the talk, I'm gonna give a couple of examples of how failing to take into account the specificity of mathematical explanation of fundamental events, of fundamental phenomena, might lead to stumble into some mistakes. Basically, if you use arguments by analogy, by learning something from explanations at higher levels and then bringing them to explanation at the lower level. Okay, so Rick Hughes is the philosopher of physics that at least for the kind of concept that I'm trying to develop, has formulated a first version of structural explanation. He really didn't give much in terms of characterizing philosophically this kind of explanation, but I think that what he gives is almost everything that was necessary in order to use it for how he wanted to use the concept. So he said that a structural explanation displays the elements of the mathematical models the theory uses and shows how they fit together. More picturesquely, it disassembles the black box, shows the working parts, and puts it together again. Brute facts about the theory are explained by showing their connection with other facts, possibly less brute. This is very vague, but I think it, in many cases it does the work that he needed it to do. A couple of very important things that he said was that this is a non-causal explanation that is independent of the question of what kind of entities and what kind of processes underlie the explanandum phenomenon. So this is from now on, it's what I say about structural explanation, which for a long time has been, was a bit fixated, obsessed by trying to say, and this is what he meant, and this is what he meant. Probably that's not what he meant, and I added the thing, so I have to admit that at one point. So structural explanation is an explanation where the explanandum is, now I see how many times I said explanation, is explained as being an instantiation of a fundamental structure of the world, rather than produced by some underlying processes. So the typical boring example of a structural explanation is the explanation of relativistic phenomena, length contraction, in the orthodox interpretation of special relativity, where length contraction is explained as an instantiation of the fundamental structure of space-time, rather than the result of a dynamical process that shrinks rod. In this view of spatial relativity, relativistic phenomena do not depend on the issue of what kind of entities and what kind of processes instantiate this phenomena. And so the explanation that we are giving of them only depends on the structure that we consider fundamental in this sense. It doesn't depend by the dynamics. So how does it work? Causal explanation. Why causal explanation provides information about the explanandum causal history, and this shows that, and also how the explanation was the result of a productive process. Structural explanation provides information about elements of reality that force us to reassess the conceptual framework within which we model the world. Such new information might concern features that we previously considered to be universal or even a priori. For instance, in the case of the explanation of length contraction, we explain how well, I'm going to say this later. The explanation consists in showing that space-time is not a Euclidean as we expected, but Minkowskian. So I remember what Hughes said about the connection between facts in the model. Brute facts about the theory I've explained by showing their connections with other facts, possibly less brutish. I have always understood that as, well, you can possibly understand that in terms of counterfactual dependence, and I think that's a useful way of seeing it. I think that counterfactuals are at the heart of explanation. I'm not sure I want to say that in counterfactual you can find the essence of explanation, and I don't think it's necessary to have like a big fact account of explanation in this sense. But I see a lot of similarities in what Hughes meant by looking how things are connected with each other, and this more modern way of seeing explanation in terms of counterfactual information. When I see dependencies, I'm also not relying to a specific metaphysical account of dependence. So I said that I was going to say something about fundamental. It's not about metaphysics, but it characterizes both what I mean by fundamental and how I interpreted Hughes' non-causality in structural explanation. So by fundamental, when I say that the explanandum is shown to be the manifestation of a fundamental structure, I mean mechanistically fundamental, in the sense that this structure is not the higher level description of the behavior of more fundamental entities that do stuff, and so when I say mechanistic, I think the most useful characterization of a mechanism that I want to use is the new mechanistic account of explanation, in terms of that can be like Mackamer, Darden, and Craver, or Glennon, but it's also, this is a very light characterization. What I really care is, like, I think that there are, and they are very important, and also in physics there are explanations where, in order to explain, you need to say what there is and what it does. And that is the heart and very interesting part of the new mechanistic account of explanation that I want to take into account here. So structural explanation is complementary to that. So it is non-causal in the sense that it's not mechanistic in this sense, and it is it uses a fundamental structure in the sense that this structure doesn't have a mechanism, it's not a higher level description of a mechanism, okay? which makes everything easier to understand. So if I show how the explanandum is the manifestation of this fundamental structure, of course, I'm saying not only that the explanation is non-causal, but the explanandum is non-causally explainable, because there is nothing under that. And this also means that structural explanation, on the one hand, in a sense, is all there is to know about that explanandum. Michael Janssen said something similar about length contraction. Once you have understood the length contraction in these terms, in these terms as kinematical, there is nothing else to learn from a causal explanation of this explanandum. So once you characterize structural explanation in these terms, it comes naturally that that's it, that's the full explanation. And this is also interesting because this leads to a comparison with the other mathematical explanations in science. On the contrary, mathematical explanations are all alone of higher level in this sense of metaphysical layers, mechanistic layers. Higher level phenomena that are mathematically explained. Sorry, I'll say that again. Mathematical explanations alone are not sufficient in the explanation of non-fundamental phenomena. I think they can be very good explanations, but they are in some sense not, and I'm going to say now why, they are not, in some sense, not sufficient for the understanding of the phenomenon. Again, I'm sorry if I'm making this massive use of especially this very boring example, but there's a lot to cover, and this is the easiest way to pass to details. So the case of the explanation of length contraction is makes things probably clear. So if I have like a kinematic, a fundamental interpretation of space-time, I'm not even gonna look for something else, another causal explanation, more fundamental. But if I consider that the explanation of that shows a mathematical explanation, but where the structure is not fundamental, is not only my right, but it's my duty, scientific duty, to keep going and trying to find the more fundamental explanation. So what do I mean that it's not the full explanation? I mean that mathematical explanations that are not structural don't explain individual events. So particular events can be fully explained by mathematical explanation, but I'm going to argue this is often hidden by contextual factors. This is in red because I'm not really happy of this fully that I say sometimes. I should work more on what I mean by fully. I think that the way I will examine, analyze the case studies, will show what I mean by fully, but I don't have like an analytical explication of what I mean by fully. Okay. So in this part of the talk, I have to argue, independently of the assumptions that I made before about how I characterize the structural explanation and blah, 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 that all the others, mathematical explanations in science are not explanations of singular phenomena, of singular events, sorry. I'm going to do it by analyzing some cases that I think are especially difficult. Yes, so, but a premise of what I'm going to say is that I think there is a sense, and a very good sense, in which a mathematical explanation can be said to explain individual events. They explain a regularity, mathematical explanations can explain the regularity, and so they explain the singular event derivatively. Since I think that the context and the interest of are an essential part in the evaluation of an explanation, and I think that the context of it and the interest makes sometimes the explanation of the regularity the most interesting part, the most important part in the analysis of a phenomenon. Sometimes these mathematical explanations are, in a sense, rightfully said to be the best explanation of the phenomenon. But this doesn't mean that we can say that the individual phenomenon is fully explained in a way that I hope it's going to be clear in the way I examine. And that is a very important sense. So a way of explaining what I mean is by contrast to Saatchi and Paxton, that say we still hold onto the idea that explanatory power is a matter of providing information about first-order modal relations, as opposed to mere structural features of such relations. I agree that the providing information about first-order modal relations is essential to this full understanding of the phenomenon. I don't think that that's a necessary condition in order to for explanation, for what we call a genuine explanation. Yes. So this is the easiest case. Are you all familiar with the example of the explanation of the life cycle of cicadas?
Yep.
So we can go through it quite easily. So the mathematical explanation is why the life cycle of cicadas is 13 or 17 years. But that's a regularity. It's not an explanation of why 13 years passed from the day that the parents were born and the children were born. An explanation of that, if I ask why did 13 years pass between the birth of the parents and the birth of the children, I can give a causal explanation, and it's actually like a basic and like an important explanation in biology. You talk about how they are made biologically, how long the eggs need to. I don't know the terms. I didn't study this perfectly, so I don't know the technical terms. But there is a whole causal explanation in terms of the biological cycle that is essential in order to understand the 13 years that have passed. While the mathematical explanation in terms of the advantages, Darwinian advantages of these 13 and 17 years is an explanation of why always this. I don't feel like I have to argue a lot about this, but maybe if you think that this specific case study I went too quickly through it, we can go back to it, because it's true that I think it's quite clear what I mean by the fact that the singular event is not explained. So what is difficult, one of the cases that is difficult is the explanation of failures. So explanations of why nobody has ever achieved to cross the Königsberg bridges in this and that way, and why mother failed to distribute her 23 strawberries evenly among her 3 children without cutting any. I think my account of why they failed to explain the singular event applies to both, so I'm going to use the mother example. So the explanation, the mathematical explanation in the literature of why mother failed is that 23 is not divisible by 3. I say that this is not the explanation of a singular event, it's just the explanation. This is a shortcut in order to say a bunch of things and then explain what we think is the interesting part in that question, forgetting everything else. But the interesting part in that question is an impossibility, not an event. In order to see that, I have to talk about the context, what is interesting, and make a lot of cleaning of from implicit assumptions that we make when we hear this question and when we give this answer. So first of all, failure, mother's failure is not an event. Mother's failure is a concept that makes reference to what mothers wanted to do. So she had aims, she had wills, a way that I can explain why failure is not the event of not occurring, the event of dividing it evenly, is that the contrast class of the explanation why did mother fail in dividing evenly is not 23 strawberries divided evenly, 23 strawberries not divided evenly. That's not, these are not two events. Okay, this is not a properly characterized contrast class. The contrast class of mother's failure is mother's success. And these are both terms that essentially imply, and even in the explanation that I have to give, a reference to the fact that mother attempted to achieve that aim. She made probably a bunch of tentatives, because if she didn't make a bunch of tentatives, even the question why did she fail doesn't make sense. Why do I have to ask why did she fail if she didn't even try? Okay, so the question about mother failure essentially refers to this interest and this context. So the question is really, given that she has made all these attempts, all these efforts, where did she go wrong? But then if my question is really, where did she go wrong? My answer must be to show that all the attempts that she made were irrelevant. And they were irrelevant because mother, she aimed at something impossible. But my answer has to make reference to the fact that she aimed to something impossible. So my explanation doesn't needs to refer to mother's aim. And in this sense, it's not an explanation in natural science, or let alone in physics. It's an explanation that has a psychological concept in it. So it's not natural science. And it's not a proper explanandum to teach us stuff about explanations in natural science. So the right answer to why mother failed is because mother aimed at something impossible. Then I can ask, but why? But then I can ask, why is mother's aim impossible? And then I say, because 23 is not divisible by 3. But 23 is not divisible by 3 is an explanation of the impossibility, not of a singular event. Okay? So I'm not sure this is convincing. I think that in order to be convincing, I have to find a way of showing what would it mean, how could it be a a natural science, a physical approach to a question like this. An explanation that can clean everything from all these implicit assumptions about the aims and stuff, because that's not natural science. That's, I don't know, psychology, or I can say because mother probably doesn't know a lot of mathematics, because otherwise she would even try to make all these attempts. So I have to clean our examples from all of this. And I think I found a good way of, illustrative way of showing how this could be. I'm not sure this is the right audience for this illustrative example. So does anybody know the Big Bang Theory? And by Big Bang Theory, I mean the popular TV show.
Yeah.
Everybody, so have you ever at least seen one episode? Do you know who Sheldon is?
Yeah.
No.
You know who Sheldon is? You don't know who Sheldon.
So I have one name. I don't watch TV.
There's always one.
He's lying.
I'm not.
So Sheldon is, so the TV show is about this bunch of nerds that meet a cute girl, pretty, well, she's not educated in science. And there's one of the characters in between these nerds is Sheldon. Sheldon is there's a word that I thought for describing the character, well, his personality. So he's not only completely mindset into physics and of course some natural science, but mostly physics. So he's really not interested in anything that is other than physics. So when he talks, there are a lot of puns in the series because people talk to him and he answers inappropriately because his mind is completely set into physics. So he already does that. He like abstracts from the stuff that we don't need. Not only, he also completely lacks of social skills, so that he's not able to see what everyone else is able to see. When someone asks a question, we all have a background that let us understand from the context what we mean, even if the question is not properly asked. Sheldon is not able to do that, and this leads to a lot of fake loves in the series. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to imagine that so there is Sheldon and Leonard and other two friends in the room. Leonard has 23 apples or strawberries, and he tries to share it evenly. And then Penny arrives, and she asks Sheldon, "Why did Mother fail to distribute her 23 strawberries evenly?" No, it should have been. No, this is the next. Leonard brought 23 strawberries, I've already said that. So Penny asks, why Leonard just failed in dividing evenly his 23 strawberries between the three of you. She wasn't, I'm sorry, I say us here, but it's between the three of you. So Sheldon, his mind is completely set into physics, so he doesn't care about the fact that he wanted to, he doesn't even consider Leonard's aims. He doesn't even, he's not able to assume by the context what Penny really wants to know. So what he does is he translates in his mind in the only way that he can do the explanandum into a properly physical explanandum, and not only of a particular event, because she wanted to know what happened just before she came into the room, okay? So he translates that into an individual event. And so he answers. So you ask why are at this moment the strawberries on the table rather than evenly distributed? Because this is the only way he can translate Penny's question into a single event. Well, if you okay, no, we'll see later why you don't agree. Well, Leonard took them. He first gave 7 to me, 7 to Raj, and 7 to Howard, and the remainder, and there were 2 strawberries left. Then he did that. So he describes everything that Leonard did, all the processes that the strawberries went through. After all these processes, he put all the strawberries back together, and the strawberries were left undivided. So Penny understands that this is one of those cases in which Sheldon is just unable to understand what she means, so she struggles to explain herself. Yes, but why did he only manage to distribute them unevenly? But still there is this manage that implies the fact that he's trying, and Sheldon doesn't even see that part of the question. Well, you mean, why did he only make uneven distributions? What other distribution did you want him to do? There were no other possible distributions. He tried all possible partitions, and they were all uneven. So Penny understands that the thing that she's not understanding is the thing about the impossibility. And she asks, and she cleans everything from the aims, why did he couldn't, he didn't manage, he failed. Okay then, why there are no possible even partition of 23 apples by 3 kids? Sorry. Meaning, why is Leonard's aim impossible? And Sheldon, well, because 23 is not divisible by 3. So I think this is the exact analysis of what goes on in the mother's failures example, and also in the Königsberg bridges example. The problem in Sheldon's first explanation, which goes through all the processes that that the strawberries went through before the final event of being undivided, is that this kind of explanation is so uninteresting that Sheldon's first answer seems preposterous. We know everything about how you can move an apple. It's really not interesting. So when someone asks why did the strawberries, he failed in dividing them, we directly go to the interesting part, what we think is the interesting part, the information that we can use, which is the fact that 23 is not divisible by 3. But this fact that we move to that part of the explanation is only determined by pragmatic factors, by the fact by our interest. The real explanation of an event, which is the event of the strawberries are in there, are not divided, is a causal explanation of, well, an explanation that goes through all the processes that the apples went, or the strawberries went through. But we have to be careful, and this is to be, well, these pragmatic factors change radically once we go to fundamental physics, because typically we don't know whether there is or how it is a process that underlines our phenomenon. Actually, that's exactly our interest, to understand what goes on under what we see, or under the structure that we think. So when we use an analogy from these cases to the other, The tricky thing is to be able to abstract by our interest. Okay. So the second example, how am I doing with time? No, but they tell me.
Unless you go over time. So we still have
You've had 45
till
minutes.
10:30. And then
I
we
started
go to
at
questions.
10:30.
So 20 minutes. So.
I still have 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So the second example, this is also difficult, is the equilibrium of a balance. And I took it from an article, recent article by Stephen and Juha Satsi. So this is the explanandum. Consider a balance in a state of equilibrium. Assume the balance remains in a state of equilibrium when particular forces are applied on its two arms. So there is, of course, and Stephen and Juha acknowledge that, a causal explanation, which talks about the forces that are added and blah, blah, blah. But there is also a mathematical explanation, which is this. Since any non-zero net torque would move the balance to a non-equilibrium state, we can take as the relevant explanations a high-level feature of the system that abstracts away from lower-level information regarding the specific forces applied. All that matters for the explanation is whether or not there is a bilaterally equivalent symmetrical distribution of forces. There is thus a natural sense in which the equilibrium depends on the symmetry. So I completely agree with this last phrase. There is a natural sense in which the equilibrium depends on the symmetry, although I don't necessarily have like a metaphysical account of these dependencies, but explanatorily, I mean, depends on the symmetry. There is a sense in which I am, well, I agree that there is a sense, but I think that still, this explanation only explains the general behavior of balances, not the singular event, and I'm going to say also why all this, again, depends on the context and on our interests. So, still, we have to do a lot of cleaning and stuff and about from our interest and not explicit assumptions that we make. So, the explanandum is why did the balance left its state of equilibrium? And the answer is because there was an asymmetrical distribution of forces. This is the mathematical explanation. But so what does non-equilibrium mean? Oh, I'm sorry, I changed it. So in my, so I have to say this. In this analysis, I changed the explanandum from the balance stays in equilibrium, and I changed it to there are more forces on one branch, and so it loses its state of equilibrium. Because when we talk about non-causal explanations of something that nothing happens, it's very tricky. It adds unnecessary complications. It's more evident than what I want to say in this case. Anyway, the equilibrium, the symmetry explanation applies to both cases, to an equilibrium case and non-equilibrium case. So this should not be problematic. So the explanation for me is that why the balance left its state of equilibrium. But what does a non-equilibrium means? The non-equilibrium means that the net force on some of the body's point is zero. But this is really not a good definition, well, characterization, or it doesn't really point at an event. It points to a generic features of different events. The net force on some of the body's points is zero. No, if you wanna identify one event, you have to say where the force, where the net force is non-zero. Okay, I think this is quite intuitive. That in some of the points is non-zero. I don't think it's a proper identification of an event. But then the Wright event is a point A, have non-zero net force in direction A, point B have a non-zero net force in direction B, or something like that. You have to say exactly where is the... But you know, if you identify this as the event, then the symmetry explanation is not sufficient, because it doesn't tell you why there was that force non-zero in that place. It's an explanation of the generic behavior of the balance, not of that event. But then the explanandum must make reference to the specific distribution of forces acting on the balance, and in particular to the fact that the arm that goes down carries more weight than the other. So again, even in this case, I think that the reason why we consider, and in a sense, again, it is a good explanation, we go directly to the symmetry explanation, because that points to what we think is the most interesting part, worth of an explanation. When we hear, why did the balance lose its state of equilibrium? We know that if we put a weight in there, that goes down and blah, blah. The most interesting part, the thing that helps us more to advance our science, that maybe we weren't that familiar before, and so it's good to hear that. It's the fact that we can grasp something about the general behavior of the balances. But this again is about the context, our interests. It doesn't say anything about the specific character of the individual event explanation. A satisfactory scientific understanding of the phenomenon and the specific explanation of the individual event can't possibly bypass the causal mechanistic explanation. Okay, so now, yes, probably I will have to, I'm not going to be able to say everything. So now I have 15 minutes. Yes.
Well, 16.
Okay. Okay. So now I'm gonna apply the conclusions that I've reached about mathematical explanations and the difference with structural explanations to specific case studies in the foundations of physics, in order to give some examples of how this kind of maybe trivial features are actually very useful to keep in mind when you work in the foundations of physics, and in specific in an explanation that involves a structure. So there is in quantum information theory, a lot of the advocates of the quantum information theory use the fact that we can have that information theoretic formulations of quantum theory seem to solve the problem of non-locality, seem to provide an explanation of quantum non-locality, and this they use it as an argument in support of the fact that quantum theory must be about information, and information have some foundation, a big fat foundational role. There are plenty of different kind of approaches, so I'm gonna take one specific approach, which is Jeff Book's information theoretic interpretation of quantum theory, which is an axiomatic approach. At least in the very beginning, he really cared about the axiomatic approach part that most recently was formulated in terms of Popescu's and Roglic PR boxes. So what is the point of this program? Is to find some principles with which to derive the structure of quantum theory. So a lot of the work of Boob and of others is to show how non-locality, or the kind of non-locality that we have in our world, depends on these principles. And in this case, in this way, you have a kind of an explanation of non-locality. So in a previous work of mine, I have argued that this is indeed a kind of a good explanation. It is a good explanation that gives us a lot of insight into non-locality, and it is actually a kind of very commonsensical kind of explanation. I take as a template for this an account of explanation in mathematics by Steiner, and so that's what I said. I said that these kind of axiomatic approaches explain non-locality in this way. A feature f of the quantum world is explained by showing how it depends, and again, not metaphysically, on what might pre-theoretically be called the nature of the quantum world. By nature, what do we mean? We mean a characterizing property, characterized in terms of as Steiner does. So a characterizing property is a property unique to a given entity or structure within a family or domain of such entities and structures. So the axioms of the information theoretic reconstructions are a characterizing property of a quantum theory that picks up quantum theory in the family, a family of other theories. In the CBH theorem, sister algebras theories, and in the Popescu's and Rohrich approach, picks up quantum theory in the family of generalized probability string theory. So this kind of explanation shows, if you take this as the nature, the core of quantum theory, this kind of explanation shows you how non-locality depends on the nature, on the essence of quantum theory. I think this is it is truly a good explanation. It gives you a lot of insights, but still, it also gives you a kind of counterfactual knowledge, because it makes you see how changing the axioms, you have a change in non-locality. This is a very interesting part of what they do in information theoretic science. So you give up one principle, and you see how non-locality changes. And still, this is a very good explanation, but it's a good explanation of non-locality in general, not of the events of singular events of correlations. One way of seeing why is that this kind of explanation fails to dissolve one of the most important reasons why we ask for an explanation of non-locality. Meaning that this explanation fails to dissolve the tension between the natural assumption that correlations are the product of a causal process, because that's what we normally think about correlations, and the fact that any such process seems to violate Lorentz invariance. So this kind of explanation don't tell you anything about this tension. Because in order to solve this tension, you need to give what I always called an explanation how, but I think it's what Juha would call a first order relation, or someone call a bottom-up explanation. It is typically for a long time, bottom-up explanations or explanations how were assumed to always be causal, but I think this is not true. A structural explanation is also an explanation how. A causal explanation shows you how, well, through a causal process. Structural explanation that answer to the question how, well, nothing happens. This is what usually happens when nothing happens. Okay? It is an explanation how. And the structure, being fundamental, provides information about first order relations. Okay, there is something else that I'd like to say. Yes, I'm going to say it. So a way that Boob has always tried to explain, to characterize the kind of explanation of non-locality that you have here is by a parallel with special relativity. So you explain non-local correlations as and this is probably my terms, an instantiation of a fundamental structure, the structure of information, exactly as you show. You explain length contraction as an instantiation, a manifestation of the fundamental structure of space-time. So, in this case, if we assume that the structure of information is fundamental, and it provides a structural explanation of correlations. So what are the consequences that we can take? So first of all, okay, we provide a structural explanation of correlations, but in this case, the assumption that the structure is fundamental is not supported by the fact that we have an explanation. First, we assume that the structure is fundamental, and we have other independent arguments to argue that. And then we say, well, if we assume that, then correlations are fully explained, okay? And this is the first lesson. Secondly, can we say then, as they say, well, and then we can say that quantum theory is about information. I really don't think you can say that. I'm going to say this very quickly, but I really want to say this part. So let's say that you have a structural explanation of a singular event of correlation. So you want to say, so the question is, why is Alice registering up when Bob is registering down? The explanation of Alice up have a bunch of elements, but has also, as an element, part of the explanandum, the fact that Bob's measurement yielded down. But the fact that Bob's measurement yielded down has inside it the measurement problem that still needs to be explained. The fact that Bob had a determinate result has nested this problem. So does Boob's quantum information theory is able to solve this problem? There are plenty of arguments. I think the most convincing for me is Hammond and Dagger, 2009, that show that information theoretic ontic, at least, for me ontic, accounts of quantum theory are not able to deal with Wigner's-Friend scenarios. And this means that they are not able to provide a solution to the measurement problem. But if they are not able to provide a solution to the measurement problem, this means that the determinateness of our measurement results needs to be explained by another part of quantum theory. And so this means that quantum theory cannot be only about information. Sorry, probably I went through very quickly to this part, but what Emma and Dagger show is that in order to solve the measurement problem, you have to open the black box and analyze measurement as a normal physical process. But this means exactly what I mean by mechanistic explanation. Opening the black box means saying what there is and what it does. And so a good explanation, a good account of quantum theory, I think, can have a structural explanation of correlations. This is what my plan for the future, to provide a better account of how this is going to work. But it can provide a good structural explanation of correlations, but still, in order to solve the measurement problem, you need a mechanistic explanation in terms of what there is and what it does. What there is and what it does, then you can have, this doesn't mean that I'm not ruling out ontic structural realism, for instance. What there is and what it does, you can account it in terms of a structure, but still you need to open the black box and say what there is and what it does. How much?
Run out of time.
Well,
Well, if you want questions, I mean.
yeah. Okay, no, I don't want questions. No, it's okay. No, it's fine. I'm closing here. There is a, yes, there is a part where I was using this in the case of the continuous symmetries explanations, but it's not fair. It's, I will stop here. In case one is curious. Then, okay, that's it. Okay.
People can ask about continuous explanations.
I'm sorry.
Okay, well, who? Okay, let's start here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Number 1.
Yeah, so getting back to the Sheldon example, the uninteresting explanation, is that still an explanation? I would rather call it a description of events rather than an explanation of events. That's my question.
Do you have any grounds for? I have an answer to that, but you probably need to argue why that's a description and not an explanation.
It's more of stating facts in a certain sense than it is describing what, yeah, how it happens or something. That would be my intuition.
Well, it's difficult to argue against intuitions, but the uninteresting account, first uninteresting account by Sheldon, is just an explanation that shows the causal history of the explanandum. What happened before, the dynamics, the dynamical details of what happened before and led to the final event. That's a typical causal explanation. Then intuitions. It's difficult to argue about against that because explanation. I take explanation as a fundamentally as a human activity. That's why interest and stuff are very important, and that's why you judge them as by how interesting they are for you. They are really not interesting, so you go, well, but that's a description. That's actually the definition. It enters in a very standard definition of a causal explanation. So either you argue against that, it's very uninteresting.
Okay, Noelia?
Yeah, it's a clarification. So the example of like the paradigmatic case of mathematical explanation of the strawberries. Maybe I understood something wrong, but so why you have the particular configuration of strawberries and people in the room? That's a causal explanation. But if you start from the configuration you have, the explanandum is whether 23 is divisible by 3. So why can't, I don't see why you can't explain particular events just by appealing to mathematical facts. I thought that was the power of mathematical explanation, that you explain individual events by appealing to mathematical facts because they are about regularities. So
Okay, so you said the explanandum, no, I'm sorry, so the explanandum is, you said that 23 is not divisible by 3.
yeah, why do you need
But if that is
anything
the-
else than that?
Why you need to answer that?
Why do you need anything else than just the mathematical facts?
You mean the explanans then, not the explanandum?
Yeah.
Ah, okay, so for you the explanans is that 23 is not divisible by 3. What does that explain?
Yeah, I mean,
The
to me
final
that explains-
configuration,
but I mean-
that the apples were there, because that's the event for me. That the apples were there is explained. So the right question for like explanation of an event for me is why are the apples there not undivided? Because 23 is not divisible by 3. I don't think it's a good explanation of that question. It's a good explanation of why Leonard failed in achieving that aim. But that's that as again.
Yeah, but to me it feels as if this is like a two-stage process. So if you want to explain why of this particular configuration, I agree that it's a causal explanation and it appeals to aims, decisions, blah blah. But once they are there, I don't see why you need anything else than the mathematical part. I think
I said that because failure is well. If your question is failure. And that's exact. That's essential in my argument. If the question you're asking is failure, failure is not an event. Failure is a concept that refers to the fact that there was someone who wanted to do that, who did this. He or she made attempts. Blah 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 blah. That's a central part of my. And that 23 is not divisible by 3. Mm-hmm. Doesn't explain that. It explains the impossibility of that aim. Okay, but you still, in the explanation of the failure, you have to use the concept that because she was aiming at something impossible, and that's not a physical explanation that she was aiming at.
Okay, so you take the full explanation.
Yeah.
And that's what you
I say that that's not, that example is not an event.
Okay, Stephen.
Thanks, Laura. I was a little worried about the role of pragmatic factors and the shifting context. So, the example that Juha and I build up to is the explanation of the halting of the collapse of white dwarf stars. And the explanandum is what Bogan and Woodward might call a phenomenon, right? Why does the collapse halt? And you appeal to Pauli exclusion principle understood as a symmetry. If you ask why did that white dwarf star, the collapse of that white dwarf star, number 578, why did that halt? Then you would appeal to specific conditions of the star, maybe specific causal processes. But there your explanandum is different. You're not explaining a phenomenon, you're explaining, like you say, you point out a specific event. So this is perhaps a minor point. It didn't seem to me that that shift was best characterized as a shift in pragmatics. It's a shift in explanandum, what you're trying to explain. And so when you say in regard to Bob's explanation, well, this is not sufficient, it's sufficient for that explanandum. Right? Appealing to the Pauli exclusion principle is sufficient for explaining why the collapse of white dwarf stars halts. Right? It's not sufficient to explain why that particular star halts, because then you have to feed in some specific information. So, I mean, would you agree with that? And if you do, what then do you see the role of pragmatic factors? Is it just a matter of choosing the explanandum, or is it deeper than that?
I don't want to say that because I want to leave open, and I truly believe that that the general symmetry explanation is, in a sense, a good explanation of the singular event. If I say that the explanandum is different, I'm not able to say that. Okay, if I go to that route. There was another thing that I wanted to say. No, I lost part of what you were saying now. I was thinking about.
Well, maybe you could just say a little bit more about what you see as the role of the pragmatics, because if you say, well, what explanandum one chooses depends on your interests. Well, that seems obvious, right? I want to explain this event, this phenomenon. But I thought you were, if you're thinking of it as something deeper than that, in the way that Van Fraassen thinks that pragmatics plays an important role in explanation, then it seems you're presenting a different
Okay,
picture.
no, I see what you mean. I see what you mean, and I think this is. I think the way I want to argue for this role of the pragmatic is a choice in strategy. If I allow for this role in the pragmatics, probably what happens is that I can show that a lot of conclusions and a lot of directions that science is taking doesn't really come from ontology, real foundational issues. It comes from the fact that we are applying. I mean, my explanation is richer in the sense that it can explain why, in a way that probably you will not like, all this, it seems that we're leading to all this importance of structure. If explanation has an essential heuristic role in science, and if I can show how pragmatic is essential in this, in all this historically in these facts, I can maybe there is a new explanation of why the structure is so important. Not because the moral will not be that the path through towards the truth is going towards the structure, but it's the path of our interest that is going towards the structure.
Okay.
I know that this is, I'm not sure, I don't have a huge intuitions about that, and I'm not ready to, is it an expression, put my hand on fire? No. Well, I don't want to insist too much on this because it's something that I'm thinking about.
Okay.
But I think it is very interesting to explore this possibility that the fact that science is converging through structure doesn't have an ontological moral, but it has more a moral in the pragmatic of science, in our interest.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Guido.
I was wondering, in your examples where the structural explanation does not provide singular explanations, the singular explanations were always of the causal mechanistic type, but take
Could you say that again? You said that I said that structural explanation does not provide the explanation of the singular facts?
It is.
No, structural explanation does provide explanations of singular events. Mathematical explanation of non-fundamental facts don't explain singular events, but structural explanation is exactly characterized by the fact that it is the only mathematical explanation that also explains singular events. That is why Boob...
right, sorry. So, rephrase it. So, if we've got say the example of the balance, so there the mathematical explanation based on symmetry didn't explain a singular case of equilibrium, and you are claiming that that kind of feature is generic, when the mathematical explanation is not structural explanation in that sense. But I was wondering about an example like
why is the Earth's orbit around the Sun elliptical? Yeah. Of course, you can give a causal mechanistic explanation. The Earth will move, because of the forces, the Earth will move now, this little bit, and then that little bit, and then that little bit, and so on. And you put all of that together, it gives you a nice ellipse. But you sort of don't see the wood for the trees if you're telling the causal story bit by bit. While if you say, well, we've got mathematical property of the solution of Newton's laws with the gravitational law, and then we've got this singular fact that the Earth and the Sun attract each other gravitationally. That would seem a perfectly good example where the mathematical explanation.
What is the mathematical explanation again?
Well, it's the property of the solutions of two-body problem. Newton's laws, gravitational force, two-body problem. We get mathematical theorem. We get conic sections, or central force. Make one body massive, central force, R-square dependency, Newton's laws, mathematical theorem, you get conic sections for the trajectories.
What's the question?
Yeah, that's a perfectly good, seems to me a perfectly good explanation of a singular event, elliptical orbit of the Earth, which is mathematical.
An elliptical orbit is not a singular event. It's an infinite sequence of...
It's a singular process.
Well, let's just call the singular event the completion of one orbit by the Earth. I mean, would that not solve that objection?
So I should study the details of this one, but it seems to me a causal explanation in mathematical terms, but still a causal explanation. I don't see why it should be a mathematical explanation. But it took me 1 week to analyze the models and the 23 strawberries. Why did you say that it's a mathematical explanation? Because it uses mathematics?
It just strikes me as
a
counterexample of causal explanation. Or, the way I think of the causal explanation. Causal explanation just isn't a good explanation, because it's sort of piecemeal, and it doesn't give you the fact that you get that particular pattern. It's not a perspicuous explanation of why you should get an ellipse.
Okay, but probably was misleading the fact that by causal explanation in effect of Sheldon, for instance, I used very tedious descriptions. But I think that that's a causal explanation too, that uses mathematics, mathematical language, but I think that's a
Okay, let's move to the next question. Jonathan.
Thank you, Laura. This is fascinating stuff. You and Hughes say that in a structural explanation, the explanandum is explained by being an instantiation of a fundamental structure. And I was wondering if you might want something more asymmetric and giving a kind of dependence ordering on the mathematical results that you're getting. So you give the example of length contraction, but length contraction, of course, it's not built into the axiom, it's a derivative result, and you have to think about how measurement works by having the endpoints of our measuring rod aligned at the same instantly, that endpoints that we can measure. We have to think about the underlying structure of the theory. So there, your work example of length contraction, I don't think of it as an instantiation of a fundamental structure in so much as it's a kind of derivative result of having a fundamental structure instantiated. And moreover, generically,
result of, say that again?
It's a result of having a relativistic structure instantiated. It's not the structure itself. I just want to get, if I could just put 3 thoughts on the table. Secondly, you might have thought that explanation generically has to have a kind of irreflexivity and asymmetry. I mean, this is a standard thought of what went wrong with DN explanation. It could be like Romberg's flagpole example, like we want to explain the length of the shadow from the height of the flagpole and the angles depended by the sun. We don't want the explanation to run in the other direction. But an instantiation of a fundamental structure doesn't give any directionality to the explanation. And you're not thinking of the explanation as like, in an important sense, a result of certain more fundamental sources, which I think we want generically from explanation. And in the examples that you went through at the end with quantum information theory and non-locality, you don't actually know what kind of axioms are in play in both systems. The ones that I've seen have something like no copying and no deletion and no broadcasting. You have some axioms like that, something like that. And then your qubits can be entangled. And from that, you can derive certain, like non-locality is a derived result of having, as you pointed out, like as you change the axioms, you'll change whether that result follows from the axioms. So it seemed to me generically what's needed for explanation, and in the particular cases that you're looking at, is an asymmetry of the kind of fundamental, maybe axiomatic structure, the axioms, versus the derivative output results theorems. And what we're explaining is why a certain theorem holds on the basis of there being certain axioms. So I'm wondering if you might want to go from the instantiation of a fundamental structure to something more ordered, something more like a partial ordering structure, something like that. The dependent result of having a fundamental structure instantiated.
Well, could you characterize a bit more the concept of result? In the sense, is it a mathematical? Just
in
mathematical.
In this case, I'm not thinking of it metaphysically. I'm thinking mathematically. This is
but structural
an
explanation
asymmetry
is
of an axiom versus a theorem in a given system, in a given axiomatization.
But although I think that that the explanation is an epistemic activity and blah blah, but only the mathematics doesn't do the explanation in a structural explanation. You want to say that there is a physical structure that does that. So the fact that that is a mathematically a result, there are explanations like that, but probably I'm missing something. I really don't see how the result, if you characterize it in mathematical terms, as a mathematical notion, it completely loses what I meant as a structural explanation.
There is the physical system has a certain structure that we can mathematically describe in certain axiomatic terms. Then we can derive mathematically certain theorems about what that entails for something characterized by those axioms, something well represented by that kind of mathematical structure. And then, given that the physical system is, well, we have some kind of representation theorem or something, and that's got to go into the story too, about why the physical system in play is being well represented by this mathematical structure at all. But then you get, so yeah, there has to be some connection to the physical system, but there still has to be some asymmetry in the story.
Yes, but it is also fundamental, essentially in the structural explanation that I say that the explanations, the structure is fundamental. If the mathematics, in mathematics you don't have this asymmetry, exactly because the axioms can be like phenomenological as one possible interpretation of information theoretic reconstructions. The axioms can be interpreted as phenomenological, and what is explained more fundamental. This doesn't happen in structural explanation, so if I use the result characterization, I lose this part too. Probably I'm not understanding, I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
You work it out over coffee.
Yeah.
Final question for Anjan.
This is actually just a quick comment, maybe suggestion for how to think about the pragmatic dimension that you were trying to spell out. Because I think that there's some ambiguity in how we think about the pragmatics here, and clarifying it might help you to answer questions like Stephen's. So one thing that we mean when we talk about the pragmatic dimension of explanation is that, I mean, some people think that explanation is pragmatic. So what it is to give an explanation is to serve some pragmatic end, right? But that's not what you mean, right? So I was wondering whether you might want to help yourself to what a lot of people do when they talk about contrastive explanation, right? So the idea of contrastive explanation is that when we request an explanation, when we ask for an explanation of something, the explanandum phenomena is kind of underspecified in the request, right? So to clarify what the explanandum is exactly, we need to say something more. We need to say why x as opposed to y, or something like that, contrast it with something, right? And often what allows us to construct the relevant contrast class, right, yx as opposed to y, or as opposed to z, etc., is something pragmatic, right? We have certain pragmatic interests in a particular explanandum phenomenon. That's where the pragmatics enters. But then, once with those interests you've identified the relevant explanandum, well then there's nothing pragmatic about which explanans is relevant to giving a good explanation, right? So that might help with respect to these kinds of questions.
No, that's good. I agree with you. In fact, I used the contrastive, the contrastive classes in the analysis of Sheldon. What was it, Sheldon? Yes, I think. Well, in the analysis of one of the two case studies. Yes, no, I thank you. That's a good answer. Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, 15-minute coffee break and an applause for Laura. And our coffee is downstairs. It's supposed to be.
It's not